What is up, besties, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Scotty Holiday. I'm a queer creator and a huge Star Wars nerd, so if you're into either one of those things, please consider subscribing and following me on social media at ScottyHolidaySW for all my latest Star Wars content. Ever since Ahsoka Part 5 gave us our first look at the Clone Wars in live action, a lot of fans are clamoring for a live action Clone Wars series, and that's exactly what I want to talk about and break down in today's video. This video was created during the 2023 WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes. Without the labor of the writers and actors currently on strike, The Clone Wars, The Bad Batch, The Book of Boba Fett, The Mandalorian, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Ahsoka would not exist. Please check the description for more information on the strike and how you can support. Let me know your initial thoughts about a live-action Clone Wars series in the comments below, and let's get into the video. Star Wars The Clone Wars is an animated series created by George Lucas and creative director Dave Filoni, set between the events of Star Wars Episode 2 and Star Wars Episode 3. The show began with a theatrical film in 2008 and ran for 6 seasons until its cancellation in 2013 following Disney's acquisition of Lucasfilm, but was eventually revived 7 years later for a final 7th season in 2020. At the time of the show's cancellation, Dave Filoni has stated that they had at least 8 seasons of content planned for the show, with season 6 getting a Netflix release the following year in 2014, and other unfinished arcs going on to be released in various comics and novels as a part of the Clone Wars Legacy multimedia project. Since the release of Season 7 in 2020, we hadn't seen any Clone Wars content on our screens, that is, until Part 5 of the Ahsoka series took us back into the era via Force Visions, but unlike before in animation, for the first time, we got to see the Clone Wars in live action. Though the sequences are brief, Ahsoka Part 5 showed us the battles of Teth, Ryloth, and the Siege of Mandalore, with Hayden Christensen reprising his role as Anakin Skywalker, and his Padawan, Ahsoka Tano, played by Ariana Greenblatt. While both actors did amazing in their respective roles, seeing an inexperienced 14-year-old kid thrown into the middle of a battlefield really put the reality of the situation into perspective for me. Regardless of their reasons, at the end of the day, the Jedi were sending children into war. There's no denying it. And before I go any further, I promise this isn't going to be one of those videos where I discuss and critique the rights and the wrongs of the Jedi Order and their decisions during this time period, but it's something that has to be mentioned nonetheless. During her vision of the Battle of Teth, Ahsoka asks Anakin, "What about my training?" And he tells her, "This is your training." In the aftermath of the Battle of Ryloth, Ahsoka tells Anakin this isn't what she trained for, but he explains that they have to adjust with the times, teaching her how to be a soldier and how to fight to survive. We then see the culmination of Anakin's teachings during the Siege of Mandalore as he tells Ahsoka, "You're a warrior now, as I trained you to be." Ahsoka puts it plainly when discussing she and Anakin's Jedi lineage and legacy, saying her part of the legacy is of death and war, and at the end of the day, that's the exact legacy of the Clone Wars. Let's not forget that the entire war was orchestrated by the Sith as a part of their grand plan to take over the galaxy, a plan that ultimately succeeds. As much as I would love to see more of the Clone Wars in live action, I truly believe it would never be able to capture what made me fall in love with the animated series so much, and that's the heart. Because this series exists in animation, it's so much easier to get transported away from the problems of the real world and into the world of these characters, whereas a live-action series already feels more grounded because it uses real people from our world. It would be so much harder to convey the lighthearted tone of the show in a live-action version, and I imagine many would complain if a live-action Clone Wars show went for the same lighthearted tone versus something more dark and gritty. Anyone who's watched the series knows it gets way darker in tone as the seasons progress, but a live-action Clone Wars would be even darker and more bleak, taking away the fantasy element and showing us the realities of war, something we only got a taste of in Ahsoka Part 5. Like, I don't know about y'all, but seeing kids run around on a battlefield in the middle of a war, fighting for their lives and trying not to get killed is not the vibe I'm looking for, and definitely not a vibe I could see Disney going along with. And this ultimately brings me to my point. Just continue telling Clone Wars stories in animation. If this was just a taste of more Clone Wars content, imagine getting an additional season or miniseries wrapping up the untold tales, giving the series and its characters a true ending, completing the story of the Clone Wars once and for all. Disney may have canceled the show in 2013, but the Clone Wars has lived on in various other forms of media. Characters created for the Clone Wars have shown up in various other animated shows, games, books, and comics, with some even making the jump to live action in Rogue One, The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, and Ahsoka. The Clone Wars series even got a spin-off series, Star Wars The Bad Batch, which uses the same distinct animation style from the Clone Wars, a style which is also used for another new Star Wars animated anthology series, Tales of the Jedi. If Disney were completely against Star Wars animation following the Clone Wars, I don't believe either of these shows would exist, nor would we see these characters and their stories continued in other media. Since the series' cancellation and the release of Season 6, Lucasfilm created The Clone Wars Legacy, a multimedia project revolved around preserving the stories from the unfinished episodes of the series, and through this project, we know of at least 12 different arcs that were in progress at the time of the cancellation. Between the video released on StarWars.com and YouTube about the Clone Wars Legacy project, and the different Clone Wars Untold panels from Star Wars Celebration 2015 and 2016, we've actually learned a lot about what these arcs would have entailed. The big three that probably come to mind when mentioning the unfinished arcs are Son of Dathomir, Crystal Crisis on Utapau, and Dark Disciple. Son of Dathomir, originally intended for the Clone Wars Season 7 as a 4-episode arc, continued Maul's story from his defeat and capture by Darth Sidious following the events of Season 5 Episode 16, The Lawless. This arc would have seen Sidious use Maul's capture to draw out Mother Talzin, leader of the Night Sisters, from hiding since he considered her a potential threat to the Sith Grand Plan. The arc would see Maul eventually escape with the help of his Mandalorian allies, take on the Separatists, and end in a climactic duel between himself and Mother Talzin versus General Grievous, Count Dooku, and Darth Sidious on Dathomir. Using the scripts from this unfinished arc, Son of Dathomir was eventually released as a 4-issue comic miniseries in 2014. What I feel is most important about this Clone Wars arc is explaining how Maul went from his defeat and capture at the hands of Sidious back to ruling Mandalore in Season 7. This arc also provides us with closure for Mother Talzin and explains why we never see her again outside of the Clone Wars series, plus giving us further context into Talzin's relationship with the Sith and Darth Sidious, which precedes the events of The Phantom Menace. Crystal Crisis on Utapau was also originally intended for Season 7 of the Clone Wars as a 4-episode arc, this time following Anakin and Obi-Wan on a mission to investigate the mysterious death of a Jedi Master on Utapau. During their investigation, they uncover a secret Separatist weapons deal involving a giant Kyber crystal and make it their mission to escape with the crystal before General Grievous and his droid army arrive. While the arc itself feels like your typical Clone Wars arc, the second episode would have seen Anakin finally discuss Ahsoka's decision to leave the Jedi Order with Obi-Wan, chastising the Jedi Council's decision to not stand by her during her trial, and ultimately causing her to leave the Order altogether. At the end of their discussion, Anakin asks Obi-Wan, "How would you feel if I turned into a major disappointment? How well would you sleep knowing I failed you?" This discussion is what makes this arc such a standout of the Untold arcs, specifically because it's the first time we would have seen Anakin open up about Ahsoka's decision to leave since they parted ways at the end of Season 5. This arc would have ultimately made their reunion in Season 7 hit even harder than it already did as well. The unfinished story rails for Crystal Crisis on Utapau were eventually released on StarWars.com, as well as a part of the Blu-ray release for the Clone Wars Season 6, The Lost Missions. The final entry of these most popular unfinished Clone Wars arcs that was eventually adapted and released as a part of the Clone Wars Legacy project is Dark Disciple. This Clone Wars story was originally intended for Season 7 as an 8-episode arc following fan favorite Asajj Ventress, providing the character with a fitting end. This arc would have seen the unlikely team-up of Ventress and Jedi Master Quinlan Vos on a mission from the Jedi Order to assassinate Count Dooku in an attempt to end the Clone Wars. This arc tackles themes of abandonment trauma, romance, the Force and the dark side, the fall of the Jedi Order, and ultimately redemption. Using the scripts for the unfinished episodes, a canon novel of the same title, Dark Disciple, was released in 2015 by author Christie Golden, and I personally cannot recommend it enough. Anyone who's been following me on social media since August of 2022 knows I am a die-hard Dark Disciple stan, and I won't lie, I'm super biased when it comes to this unfinished arc because it's the one that resonated with me the most. Asajj Ventress is also such a standout character from the Clone Wars series, with some even considering her the foil to Ahsoka Tano. Season 3 of the Clone Wars saw Ventress betrayed by Dooku, denounce the Sith, and return to her Night Sister roots on the path of revenge. Season 4 saw her become a lone bounty hunter, and then in Season 5, eventually assists in proving Ahsoka's innocence for the bombing of the Jedi Temple. Ventress was already on her path towards redemption in her final appearances in the Clone Wars Season 5, and Dark Disciple would have finally provided us with closure and a fitting end for the character, where I believe her actions display the characteristics of a true Jedi. All three of these unfinished arcs, Son of Dathomir, Crystal Crisis, and Dark Disciple, are the three that I believe are integral to the Clone Wars series as a whole, and it's a shame they were never released as originally intended. However, I still believe they're worth revisiting and releasing, whether that be as standalone specials or 3 separate mini-series that would work perfectly on Disney+. Another lesser-known unfinished arc that would provide much-needed context for the Bad Batch Season 1 and the Book of Boba Fett more importantly is the Bounty Hunter arc. This arc was an unfinished 4-episode story that would have revolved around the relationship between Boba Fett and Cad Bane, seeing them go on a mission along with other popular Clone Wars bounty hunters to rescue a child kidnapped by the Tusken Raiders and ending in a climactic duel between the two. This duel would have provided an explanation for the metal plate Cad Bane has on his head in the Bad Batch Season 1 and the origin of the dent in Boba Fett's helmet. This arc would also give much needed context for their rematch in the Book of Boba Fett, since the events of the arc are alluded to in their dialogue from their past history. There's also a handful of other unfinished Clone Wars arcs mentioned by Dave Filoni and Pablo Hidalgo during the Untold Clone Wars panel at Celebration 2015 and Ahsoka's Untold Tales at Celebration 2016. While they're less integral to the series as a whole, I thought they were still worth mentioning. Perhaps the most exciting would have been the Return to the Jedi Temple arc, which would have taken place sometime after Ahsoka's decision to leave the Order. After discovering a threat in the Coruscant underworld and warning the Jedi, we would have seen Ahsoka team back up with Anakin and Obi-Wan to rescue Master Yoda from the Sith Shrine deep below the temple. This arc would also show Ahsoka's first encounter with Darth Sidious, protecting and keeping him from entering the temple's holocron vault. Looking over the imagery, I'm curious if this arc or artwork inspired their encounter in Star Wars Rebels Season 4, Episode 13, A World Between Worlds. Some other unfinished arcs mentioned were a Return to Mon Cala, a Rex and R2 Top Gun inspired arc, and an X-Files inspired story including the Yuzong Vong. Back in 2010, Dave Filoni mentioned the possibility of bringing back the Zillo Beast for the Clone Wars Season 7, and he eventually did, except this time in the Bad Batch Season 2, Episode 11, Metamorphosis. And I can't talk about unfinished Clone Wars arcs and providing closure for these characters and stories without mentioning Barriss Offee. Dave Filoni revealed during the Celebration 2015 Untold Clone Wars panel that Barriss was originally going to die at the end of Season 5, but he specifically cut that part since he didn't want that fate for her. At the time, he said he still had plans for Barriss, but we have yet to see her return. Not all of these arcs went unfinished though, and for the eventual Clone Wars Season 7 we got on Disney Plus in 2020, we got to see an updated version of the Bad Batch arc, Ahsoka's Walkabout arc, as well as the Siege of Mandalore arc. In 2015 at Celebration Anaheim, as a part of the Clone Wars Untold panel, Dave Filoni talked about a Kashyyyk arc that would have seen Yoda and his clone battalion fighting alongside the Wookiees against the separatist allied Trandoshans, with elements of this story later adapted and even referenced as having taken place previously in the Bad Batch Season 2 Episode 6, Tribe. With each of these unfinished arcs, Pablo Hidalgo explained that even though these Clone Wars episodes did not get publicly revealed, they still look at their core stories as having happened. And I believe that Disney and Lucasfilm are well aware of how marketable the Clone Wars series and its stories were and still are to the fans. Think about how many new Order 66 scenes we've seen since the series cancellation in media such as Jedi Fallen Order, The Bad Batch, The Book of Boba Fett, The Mandalorian, Obi-Wan Kenobi, multiple comics, and books even as recently as this year with Inquisitor Rise of the Red Blade, which also spent a lot of time in the Clone Wars era. Ahsoka Part 5 gave us our first look at the Clone Wars in live action, and people went wild, myself included. Disney and Lucasfilm know that the fans are still interested in this time period, and they've proved that by revisiting it so many times throughout Star Wars media. The least they could do is allow the final stories of the series to be finished and released in animation as originally intended, and if not for the passion of the fans, for the hard work and dedication of the team behind the series and the cast of voice actors that brought these characters and stories to life. This all goes to say that in the end, I believe the Clone Wars should remain in animation, and if Disney and Lucasfilm want to keep revisiting the era, they should do their due diligence and allow these final integral arcs to be released to finally complete the series once and for all. The team behind the series deserves it, the stories and the characters deserve it, and last but not least, we the fans deserve it. So what are your thoughts on the Clone Wars series? Do you think it should remain in animation, or would you like to see a live-action Clone Wars series? What unfinished arc would you like to see most? Let me know down in the comments below, or join my Discord so we can continue the conversation together. Make sure to like, subscribe, and consider following me on social media at ScottyHolidaySW for all my latest Star Wars content. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, may the Force be with you.